My grandson thought I was telling him a ghost story. "Grandpa, come on," Marcus said, scrolling through his phone in the passenger seat. "A whole town just disappeared? That's not real." I kept my hand steady on the steering wheel, watching the Florida highway stretch ahead of us. Spanish moss hung from the oak trees like old mourning veils. The sun was already hot at 9 in the morning, the kind of heat that makes the asphalt shimmer like water. "Put the phone down, Marcus. We're almost there." "There's nothing out here," he said, but he put the phone in his pocket. He was 17, smart as they come, headed to college next year. But there were things they didn't teach him in school. Things they erased from the history books on purpose. That's why I brought him here. I turned off Highway 24 onto a smaller road that cut through the woods. The forest was thick on both sides, pine trees, palmettos, and that dense Florida underbrush that swallows everything if you let it. "This is where Rosewood was," I said quietly. "Right here, where you see trees and dirt." Marcus looked out the window, his expression changing from skepticism to confusion. "What do you mean, was?" I pulled the truck over to the side of the road and killed the engine. The silence rushed in. No traffic, no voices, just the buzz of insects and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. "Get out. I want to show you something." We walked into the woods about 50 yards. I'd been here before, years ago with my father. He'd shown me the same thing his father showed him, the passing down of memory when nothing else was left. I stopped at a clearing where the ground was slightly higher than the surrounding forest floor. Wildflowers grew in patches, yellow and purple, pretty in an accidental way. "This was Cedar Street," I said, my voice catching in my throat the way it always does when I come here. "The main road through town. Your great-great-grandmother, Eliza Holloway, had a store right about where you're standing. She sold dry goods, fabric, tools. She saved every penny for 15 years to build that store." Marcus stood very still, looking down at the ground like he could see through the dirt and roots to what was underneath. There were over 300 people living here in 1923. Black families, most of us. We had our own school, our own church, our own businesses. This wasn't some poor settlement, Marcus. We were doing well, better than a lot of white towns around here, and that's exactly why they couldn't stand it. What happened? His voice was different now, softer. He knew something terrible was coming. "A white woman lied," I said simply. "Fannie Taylor. January 1st, 1923. She claimed a black man attacked her in her house in Sumner, the town next door. No proof, no evidence, just her word. But that was all it took." I walked a few steps to the left to where an old stone chimney still stood, covered in vines and forgotten by everyone except us. This was the Williams house. Sarah Williams taught at the school. She had 3 children. On January 4th, a mob came through here with guns and torches. They were hunting for a man named Jesse Hunter, an escaped convict they claimed was hiding here. He probably was never here at all, but they used it as an excuse. Marcus touched the chimney stones, his fingers tracing the blackened marks where fire had licked the brick over a century ago. "They shot Sam Carter on the road," I continued, my voice steady, even though my chest felt tight. "Tied him to a car and made him tell them where black people were hiding, even though there was nothing to tell. They killed him anyway. Then they went house to house. If you were black and you lived in Rosewood, you had two choices: run into the swamps and hope you didn't get shot in the back, or stay and burn. Grandpa, no, you need to hear this. They killed Sarah Williams' nephew, a boy barely older than you. They shot Lexi Gordon in her own house. They burned the church. They burned the school. They burned every single black-owned building in this town. For 6 days, Marcus. 6 days of terror. I pointed toward what looked like nothing but forest. That way, about a quarter mile, was the train depot. On January 6th, the last day of the massacre, they loaded the women and children onto a train, the ones who survived anyway. They sent them to Gainesville with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Everything they owned was ash. How many people died? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The official count? 6? The real count? We'll never know. They buried people in the woods, in the swamps. Bodies that were never found. Families that just vanished from record. The state of Florida said 6 people died. Could you believe that? An entire town destroyed, and they wrote down 6. I knelt down and picked up a handful of soil, let it run through my fingers. And here's the worst part, Marcus. Nobody was arrested, not one person. The white mob came from all over Levy County, some from as far as Georgia. Everybody knew who did it. Newspapers reported their names, but not a single arrest, not a single trial. They just went home. Marcus sat down on the ground, his back against the old chimney. His eyes were wet. Why didn't they teach us this in school? Because shame is easy to bury, I said. Because it's easier to pretend it never happened than to admit what your neighbors did. Florida didn't even acknowledge the massacre until 1993, 70 years later. They paid some reparations to the survivors, the ones they could find. But money doesn't bring back the dead, Marcus. It doesn't bring back a town. I pulled out my phone and showed him a photograph I'd saved. It was a class photo from the Rosewood School, taken in 1922. 23 children, all dressed in their Sunday best, standing in front of a wooden building with a tin roof. They were smiling. "That's your great-great-grandmother," I said, pointing to a young girl in the front row. She was 9 years old when this photo was taken. 1 year later, she was running through those woods in the middle of the night, hiding from men with guns and dogs. Marcus stared at the photo for a long time. She survived? She survived, barely. She never talked about it much, but my grandfather told me some of what she'd seen. The smoke, the screaming, the way the sky looked orange from all the fires. She said she could smell burning wood and flesh for weeks afterward, even when they were miles away. I put the phone back in my pocket and looked around at the empty forest. Rosewood was erased, Marcus, not just burned, erased. They removed it from maps. They stopped delivering mail here. They even changed the name of the post office. By 1925, this place officially didn't exist. If you looked at a Florida map from 1930, you'd see Sumner, you'd see Gulf Hammock, but Rosewood? Gone, like it never was. But it was here, Marcus said fiercely. These people were here. They lived here. They built homes here. Yes, they did. And that's why we're here today. Because somebody has to remember. Somebody has to say their names. Somebody has to stand on this ground and say, this happened and it was wrong, and we will not forget. I helped Marcus to his feet. We stood together in that clearing, 2 black men on a stolen ground, holding on to a history that tried to bury itself. The story didn't end that night, I said. It kept going. It's still going. Every time someone pretends racism is over, every time someone says, that was a long time ago, every time someone asks why we're still talking about this, Rosewood is the answer. Marcus looked at me, his jaw set with something I recognized. The same anger and grief and determination I felt the first time my father brought me here. Tell me everything, he said. I want to know every name, every story, everything they tried to erase. I put my hand on his shoulder. Then we better get comfortable, because this is going to take a while. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. We sat on the tailgate of my truck, and I opened the folder I'd brought with me. Inside were photographs, yellowed newspaper clippings, census records, and handwritten notes my father had compiled over decades. This was our archive, our proof that Rosewood existed. You have to understand what this town was, I began, spreading a map across my lap. It was a hand-drawn map from 1915, showing every building, every street, every piece of land in Rosewood. This wasn't some ramshackle settlement. We're talking about a community that owned land, built businesses, educated their children. In 1915, in the middle of Jim Crow, Florida, that was revolutionary. Marcus leaned in, studying the map. See here? I pointed to a plot near the center. That was the Goins family property. They owned over 100 acres of land, most of it in cedar trees. That's where the town got its name. Rosewood, because of all the cedar and the way it smelled when you cut it. James Carrier and his family worked in the timber industry. They employed people, black and white. I pulled out a photograph of a large, well-built house with a wraparound porch and manicured yard. That was the Carrier house. 2 stories, indoor plumbing. They had a piano in the parlor. Sarah Carrier could read and write, and she made sure her children could too. Her son, Sylvester, was a veteran, fought for this country in World War I, came home to Rosewood and worked as a handyman. He was one of the men they killed. Marcus took the photo carefully, like it was sacred, which I suppose it was. Rosewood had a Masonic lodge, I continued, a baseball team, a general store run by John Wright, a white man who actually treated black folks with respect, one of the very few. We had a sugar mill, a turpentine still, and families who'd been living there since Reconstruction. I showed him another photo, this one of a small wooden church with a bell tower. That's the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal. Every Sunday that place was packed. They'd sing hymns you could hear from half a mile away. My great-grandfather told stories about Christmas Eve services that lasted until dawn, with everyone bringing food and the children performing plays. It sounds beautiful, Marcus said quietly. It was, but here's the thing people don't understand about Rosewood. It wasn't just beautiful, it was threatening. Not because the people there did anything wrong, but because their very existence challenged the narrative white folks were telling themselves. I pulled out a census record from 1920. Look at these numbers. Literacy rates among the black residents of Rosewood were higher than the Florida average for white people. Home ownership rates were astronomical. We're talking over 80%. These families were accumulating wealth, Marcus. Generational wealth. They were sending their kids to school, building equity, establishing businesses. And white people couldn't handle that, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. No, they couldn't. Because if black people in Rosewood could succeed, it exposed the lie that segregation and discrimination were about capability or intelligence. It proved that when we had opportunity, we thrived, and that made us dangerous. I showed him a newspaper clipping from the Gainesville Sun, dated 1921. It was an advertisement. Williams General Store, Rosewood, Florida, dry goods, hardware, fabrics, fair prices, honest dealings. I read aloud. Your great-great-grandmother put that ad in the paper. She was proud of her business. She had every right to be. I could see Marcus trying to picture it, this thriving town, these proud people, in a place that now looked like it had never been touched by human hands. Tell me about the people, he said, not just the facts. Tell me who they were. I smiled. That's exactly what my father had done for me. All right, let's start with Aunt Sarah Carrier. Now, she wasn't my actual aunt, but everybody called her that. She was a midwife, delivered half the babies in Rosewood and several in the surrounding white towns, too. White women would send for her in the middle of the night because they trusted her hands more than the white doctors. I paused, remembering the story my grandfather told me. She had this saying, "Every child is a miracle, no matter what color they come out." She delivered over 200 babies by the time she was 50. She knew remedies for fever, for difficult births, for childhood ailments. She kept a garden of medicinal herbs behind her house. What happened to her? Marcus asked, though I could tell he already knew the answer. She died defending her home. We'll get to that part. I pulled out another photo, this one of a stern-looking man in a suit. This is Aaron Carrier, Sarah's husband. He worked at the Cummers Sawmill in Sumner. Started as a laborer, worked his way up to foreman, one of the few black foremen in the whole county. He was respected by the men who worked under him, black and white. He saved his money, bought land, built that house I showed you. Was he killed too? No. He was away working when the massacre started. He survived, but he never recovered from losing his wife, his home, his town. He died in 1934, a broken man. I showed Marcus photo after photo, told him story after story. This is Lexi Gordon. She was a teacher, educated at a colored teachers' college in Tallahassee. She taught at the Rosewood School for 12 years. Her students loved her. She was strict but fair, and she believed that education was the path to freedom. This is James Carrier, Sarah's son. He played baseball, worked in the mills, married a woman named Emma. They had 3 children. This is Philomena Goins, called Philly by everyone who knew her. She made the best peach cobbler in 3 counties. She'd sell them at church fundraisers, and people would line up. Each name, each face, each story was a brick I was laying down, rebuilding Rosewood in Marcus's mind the way it deserved to be remembered, not as a tragedy, but as a triumph, at least until it was stolen. The children went to school in a one-room schoolhouse, I continued. They learned reading, writing, arithmetic, history. They had textbooks that were hand-me-downs from the white schools. But the teacher, Miss McCoy, she made sure they learned everything the white children learned, and then some. I pulled out a photo of the school class, the same one I'd shown Marcus earlier, but now I pointed out individual faces. That's Emma Jackson. She wanted to be a nurse. That's Moses Williams, Aunt Sarah's nephew. He loved mathematics, could do calculations in his head faster than most adults. That's Minnie Lee Mitchell. She had the prettiest singing voice you ever heard. Did any of them survive? Emma and Minnie Lee did. They made it onto the train. Moses didn't. He was 16 years old when they shot him. The weight of that hung in the air between us. The thing about Rosewood, I said, my voice getting rough, is that it represented possibility. It proved that, given a fair chance, black families could build something lasting, could create wealth, could educate their children, could live with dignity. I showed him a deed, a land deed from 1910, transferring 4 to 5 acres to Martin Goins. This is what they destroyed, Marcus. Not just buildings. They destroyed the accumulation of decades of work, of saving, of sacrifice. When they burned Rosewood, they burned deeds. They burned bank books. They burned proof of ownership. And without proof, what do you have? Nothing. They knew what they were doing, Marcus said, anger sharpening his words. Yes, they did. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated economic destruction. Because if you destroy a black community's wealth, if you drive them off their land, if you burn their businesses, you set them back generations. You make sure they have to start over with nothing, and then you can say, see, they can't succeed, they're not capable. I pulled out one more photo. It was faded, but you could still make out what it showed. A group of men and women standing in front of the church, all dressed in their Sunday best. They were smiling. This was taken on Easter Sunday, 1922, 9 months before the massacre. Look at their faces, Marcus. They had no idea what was coming. They thought they'd built something that would last. They thought their children would inherit these homes, these businesses, this land. Marcus's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle working. They should have, he said. Yes, they should have. But in 1923 in Florida, being black and successful was a crime in itself. The real crime, the one that started all this, it wasn't anything Jesse Hunter did or didn't do. It wasn't Fannie Taylor's lie. The crime was that Rosewood existed at all. I closed the folder and looked out at the forest where a town used to be. On New Year's Day, 1923, Rosewood was home to over 300 people. They woke up that morning thinking about their lives, their work, their families. The children were off from school for the holiday. People were visiting relatives, cooking food, making plans for the new year. I paused, letting the image settle. By January 7th, it was all gone. Every building burned, every family scattered, every dream destroyed, and the people who did it went home to their own families, sat down to dinner, and never faced a single consequence. Marcus stood up, paced a few steps, then turned back to me. Grandpa, why didn't people fight back? Why didn't they defend themselves? Some did. Sylvester Carrier died fighting. He and his mother Sarah held off that mob for hours, shooting from the windows of their house. They killed 2 white men before the house was burned down around them. But Marcus, you have to understand, this wasn't a fair fight. This was a mob of hundreds of armed white men against isolated families. This was the sheriff and his deputies either participating or standing aside. This was the entire power structure of the state saying, "We will not protect you." I looked at him hard. And if black folks had fought back harder, if they'd killed more white men, it would have been even worse. They would have called it an insurrection. They would have sent in the National Guard. They would have massacred every black person in Levy County. The people of Rosewood did what they had to do to survive, and even then, survival was a matter of luck. Marcus nodded slowly, processing it all. "But you're right to be angry," I continued. "They should have fought. They should have had the law on their side. They should have had justice. But this is America, Marcus. And in 1923, justice wasn't for people who looked like us." I gathered up the photos and documents, put them carefully back in the folder. There's more to tell about the massacre itself, about what happened in those 6 days, about the train that carried the survivors away, about the decades of silence that followed. But I want you to hold on to what I just showed you. I want you to remember that before Rosewood was destroyed, it was built. It was real. It was thriving. These were real people with real lives, real hopes, real dreams. "I'll remember," Marcus said fiercely. "I promise." And I believed him, because that's how memory survives, not in buildings or documents, but in the hearts of the people who refuse to forget. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky. We'd been standing in these woods for hours, but I could tell Marcus wasn't ready to leave. He needed to know the whole story, the way I'd needed to know it when I was his age. I took a deep breath. This was the hardest part to tell. "January 1st, 1923, I began. Fannie Taylor, a white woman, 22 years old, married to a mill worker in Sumner. That morning, she showed up at her neighbor's house, beaten and bruised. She claimed a black man had broken into her house and attacked her. But it wasn't true, Marcus said. No. Years later, people who knew her said it was probably her white lover who beat her, a man she was having an affair with while her husband was at work. But the truth didn't matter. She pointed the finger at a black man, and that was enough. I pulled out a timeline I'd written down years ago, events compiled from survivor testimonies and newspaper accounts. The sheriff, Robert Elias Walker, he formed a posse immediately. They were looking for Jesse Hunter, a black man who'd escaped from a chain gang. They said he was hiding in Rosewood. There was no evidence he was anywhere near Rosewood, but that didn't matter either. They had an excuse, and they were going to use it. January 1st, first day, the posse goes to Rosewood questioning people, searching homes. Aaron Carrier, the man I told you about, he wasn't home. He was working in Sumner, but they came to his house anyway. Sarah Carrier, his wife, she told them the truth. She hadn't seen any strangers. Nobody in Rosewood had. The posse left, but they were angry. Angry that black folks weren't cowering, weren't giving them what they wanted. I paused, remembering how my grandfather's voice would shake when he told this part. January the 2nd, they found a black man named Sam Carter. He worked as a blacksmith, transported people across the river sometimes. They accused him of helping Jesse Hunter escape. They tortured him, Marcus, tied him behind a car and dragged him down the road, demanding he tell them where Hunter was hiding. Sam Carter didn't know anything. There was nothing to tell. But they kept torturing him until he couldn't speak anymore. Then they hanged him from a tree and shot him. Marcus's hands had balled into fists. His body hung there for days. They left it there as a warning, as a message to every black person in the county. This is what happens when you don't give white folks what they want. January 3rd, the news spreads. White men from all over Levy County, from Otter Creek, from Chiefland, from as far away as Georgia, they're coming to Rosewood. Not lawmen, not a legal posse, a mob. Some of them are Klan. Some are just regular white men who heard there was a Negro hunt and wanted to join in. I showed Marcus a newspaper clipping from the Gainesville Daily Sun. "Armed men searching for Negro," I read. That's how they described it in the papers, like it was a legal operation, like it was justice. January 4th, this is when it turns into a massacre. A mob of white men descends on Rosewood. They're going house to house now, not looking for Jesse Hunter anymore. That pretense is gone. They're looking for any black man they can find. They shoot a man named James Carrier in front of his family. They hunt down his brother, Sylvester. I pulled out a drawing someone had made from a survivor's description, a simple sketch of the Carrier house surrounded by armed men. Sylvester Carrier and his mother Sarah, they took refuge in their house with several other people, women, children, trying to hide. The mob surrounded the house. They demanded Sylvester come out. He refused. He and Sarah had guns, and they knew how to use them. "Ah, good," Marcus said fiercely. The siege lasted all night. Sylvester and Sarah shot from the windows. They killed 2 white men, C.P. Wilkerson and Henry Andrews. They wounded 4 others. For one night, Marcus, they held that mob off. One black man and his mother defending their home against hundreds of armed white men. What happened? At dawn, the mob set the house on fire. They burned it to the ground with Sarah and Sylvester inside. Moses Williams, Sarah's nephew, the boy I told you about who was good at math, he tried to escape through a window. They shot him. He was 16 years old. I had to stop for a moment, even after all these years. After telling this story so many times, it still hit me like a punch to the gut. January 5th, the mob is in a frenzy now. 2 white men are dead, and they want revenge. They burn the church. They burn the school. They go through Rosewood like a plague, setting fire to every black-owned building they can find. The general store, the houses, the Masonic Lodge, everything. Some families tried to hide in the swamps. Can you imagine, Marcus? January in Florida. It's cold at night. Families huddled in the palmetto scrub, in the water, trying to stay quiet while white men with dogs and torches hunted them, babies crying and mothers having to cover their mouths, praying they wouldn't be heard. Lexi Gordon, the teacher I told you about, she hid in the woods. They found her. She was carrying important papers, deeds, and documents she'd tried to save. They shot her and burned the papers. January 6th, John Wright, the white store owner I mentioned, he helped some of the survivors. He hid women and children in his store and in his house. When a train came through, he helped load them onto it. The women were crying, begging to go back for their husbands, their fathers, their sons. But the men told them to go, to save the children. I pulled out a photograph of the train depot in nearby Gainesville. This is where the train stopped. Survivors said there were about 25 women and children who made it onto that train. They arrived in Gainesville with nothing, no money, no clothes except what they wore, no food. Some of them didn't even have shoes. What about the men who stayed behind? Some hid in the woods for days, then made their way north on foot. Some went to other towns, changed their names, never came back. Some we never heard from again. They're probably buried in those swamps, Marcus. Unmarked graves that nobody ever looked for because nobody with power cared. January 7th, the mob burns what's left. By noon, Rosewood is gone. Every building is rubble and ash. Every home is destroyed. The mob goes back to Sumner, to Chiefland, to their farms and their families. and nothing happens to them. Nothing. I showed him another newspaper clipping, this one from January 10th. 8 whites, 2 Negroes killed in Rosewood, it says. That's what they reported. 8 whites killed? That's a lie. Only 2 white men died. The ones Sylvester and Sarah shot in self-defense. But they inflated the white death count to make it seem like the violence was mutual, like it was a battle instead of a massacre. And they said only 2 black people died. 2. When dozens were killed, when an entire community was destroyed. Marcus was shaking his head in disbelief. The sheriff, Robert Walker, the man who was supposed to protect the citizens of Rosewood, he testified that he couldn't control the mob. He said there were too many men, too much anger. He said his hands were tied. But here's what he didn't say. He never arrested anyone. He never even tried. The names of the mob leaders were known. People wrote them down. Newspapers printed some of them. But Walker never filed a single charge. The governor of Florida at the time was Kerry Hardy. Survivors wrote to him, begging for help, for protection, for justice. Some letters were written by black ministers, by teachers, by people with education who knew how to frame their pleas in language that might move a white politician. I had copies of some of those letters. I read one aloud to Marcus. Your Excellency, we, the colored citizens of Rosewood, appeal to you for protection. Our homes have been burned, our property destroyed, our loved ones murdered. We ask only for the justice that the law promises to all citizens of this state. We ask for protection from further violence. We ask that the perpetrators of these crimes be held accountable. What did the governor do? Marcus asked. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. He never responded. He never sent help. He never ordered an investigation. Rosewood burned, and the state of Florida looked the other way. I put the letters away and looked at Marcus. In the weeks after the massacre, some survivors tried to go back. They wanted to rebuild, to reclaim their land. But the white community made it clear, if you come back, we'll kill you. So they didn't. They scattered across Florida, across the South, across the country. Family members who'd lived next door to each other for generations lost touch. Children grew up not knowing their cousins, their roots, their history. And Rosewood itself? By 1925, it was off the maps. The post office closed. Mail stopped being delivered there. If you looked at official records, it was like the town had never existed. The land, much of it was seized for unpaid taxes. Taxes that the survivors couldn't pay because they'd lost everything and had no way to prove ownership. White families moved in, bought the land for nothing, built new homes on the ashes of the ones they'd burned. That's not just murder, Marcus said. That's theft. That's erasure. Yes, that's exactly what it is, and it worked for a long time. People forgot, or pretended to forget. Rosewood became a ghost story, a rumor, something that maybe happened but nobody wanted to talk about. But some people remembered, I said, touching the folder of documents. The survivors remembered. They told their children. Who told their children? Who told me? They wrote things down. They kept photos, kept records, kept the memory alive even when it was dangerous to do so. And slowly, over decades, the truth started to come out. In the 1980s, a journalist named Gary Moore started investigating. He interviewed survivors, looked at records, pieced together what really happened. In 1993, the Florida legislature finally acknowledged the massacre. They paid reparations, $150, $0 to each verified survivor. 9 people qualified. 9 out of 300. $150,000, Marcus said bitterly, for your home, your family, your entire life. It's not about the money, Marcus. It's about the recognition. It's about the state finally saying, yes, this happened. Yes, it was wrong. Yes, we failed you. That matters. The sun was touching the horizon now, painting the sky orange and red. The same colors the sky must have been when Rosewood burned. They tried to erase this place, I said. They tried to erase these people. They tried to erase the truth. But we're still here. We're still telling the story. We're still saying their names. And as long as we do that, Rosewood isn't dead. It's just waiting to be remembered. We drove back as the sun set, but neither of us spoke for a long time. Marcus sat with a folder of documents on his lap, occasionally pulling out a photo or a letter and studying it in the fading light. I could see him processing it all, trying to find a place in his mind for a story this big, this painful, this important. Finally, as we hit the highway, he spoke. What happened to the survivors after they left, I mean? I'd been waiting for that question. They scattered. Most of them went to Gainesville first, stayed with relatives or in black churches that took them in. But they couldn't stay. There was no work, no way to rebuild their lives. So they kept moving. Your great-great-grandmother, Eliza, she ended up in Jacksonville. She worked as a domestic for a white family, cleaning houses, washing clothes. She never owned a business again. All that she'd built in Rosewood, all those years of saving and working, gone. She started over with nothing. She married again, years later, had 2 more children, but people who knew her said she was never the same. She'd wake up in the middle of the night sometimes, crying or screaming. What we call PTSD now. They just called it being troubled. She carried Rosewood with her every day of her life. I pulled out onto Highway 19, heading south. A lot of the survivors never talked about it. Not to their children, not to anyone. The shame was too deep. Not shame about what they did. Shame about what was done to them. Shame about being driven from their homes, about losing everything, about being powerless to stop it. That's not their shame to carry, Marcus said angrily. No, it's not. But trauma doesn't care about fairness. They lived in a world that told them if something bad happened to black folks, it was somehow their fault. So they buried the story, they buried the pain, and they tried to move forward. Some survivors did talk, though. Minnie Lee Langley. She was one of the children who made it onto the train. She spoke about Rosewood late in her life in the 1980s when Gary Moore was doing his investigation. She was elderly by then, but she remembered everything. The fires, the screaming, her mother covering her mouth in the woods so she wouldn't cry out. She said it was important for people to know the truth. I showed Marcus a photo of Minnie Lee taken in 1994 at a Rosewood memorial service. She was old, her face lined with years, but her eyes were fierce. She died in 1995 at 82 years old, but before she died, she saw Florida acknowledge what happened. She saw the memorial marker go up. She saw some justice, even if it was 70 years too late. We drove in silence for a while, and then Marcus asked, "What about the people who did it? The mob? Did any of them ever face consequences?" "No, not one. Some of them lived long lives, died peacefully in their beds surrounded by their grandchildren. Some of them became respected members of their communities, business owners, church deacons, city councilmen, they went to their graves without ever being held accountable. Their descendants still live in Levy County. Some of them probably don't even know their grandfathers were part of the mob. Some know and don't care. Some know and carry their own quiet shame. In 2004, the state put up a heritage marker near where Rosewood used to be. It tells the story of the massacre, lists some of the names of the dead. It's something, I guess, a way of saying this happened here. But it's not enough. It will never be enough. Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the dark Florida landscape rolling past. "Grandpa," he finally said, "how do you live with knowing this? How do you drive past Sumner, past all these towns where the people who did this lived, and not feel rage every second?" I'd asked myself that question 1,000 times. I do feel rage, Marcus. Every time I think about it, every time I tell this story, I feel it burning in my chest. But I also feel something else. I feel pride. Pride. Pride in the people of Rosewood who built something beautiful in the face of impossible odds. Pride in Sylvester and Sarah Carrier, who fought back when fighting back meant death. Pride in the mothers who saved their children, the survivors who kept the memory alive, the descendants who refused to let this story die. And I feel responsibility, the responsibility to make sure their names are remembered, to make sure their lives meant something, to make sure the next generation, your generation, knows what happened so it never happens again. Marcus nodded slowly. "They tried to erase Rosewood," I continued, "but they failed because we're here, because you know the story now, because you'll tell your children and they'll tell theirs. That's how we win, Marcus. Not by getting revenge, not by making white people feel guilty. We win by refusing to forget, by refusing to let them write us out of history." I pulled off the highway and into a rest stop. We both needed to stretch our legs, clear our heads. We stood outside in the warm night air, and I showed Marcus one more thing, a small memorial booklet from the 1994 Rosewood ceremony. Inside were the names of the known victims: Sarah Carrier, Sylvester Carrier, James Carrier, Lexi Gordon Mingo Williams, Sam Carter. 6 names, I said. That's all we know for certain. But there were more, so many more whose names we'll never know. Marcus read the names aloud, slowly, like a prayer. "There's a Rosewood Heritage Foundation now," I told him. "They preserve the history, maintain the memorial site, educate people. They make sure school kids in Florida learn about the massacre, so it's not forgotten again. And there's a movie. John Singleton directed it in 1997. It takes some liberties with the facts, dramatizes some things, but it brought the story to millions of people who'd never heard of Rosewood. That matters too. But Marcus, here's what I want you to understand. Rosewood isn't just history. It's not something that happened 100 years ago and is over now. The systems that allowed Rosewood to happen, the racism, the economic dispossession, the legal injustice, the state-sanctioned violence, those systems are still here. They've evolved, they've gotten more subtle, but they're still here. When black communities are destroyed through urban renewal or gentrification, when black-owned businesses struggle to get loans while white businesses thrive, when the justice system treats us differently than white folks, that's Rosewood's legacy. That's the same story, just in different clothes. Marcus looked at me, his young face serious in the harsh light of the rest stop. So what do? How do we change it? We do what the people of Rosewood did before it was destroyed. We build, we educate ourselves, we support each other, we create wealth, create businesses, create communities that can't be easily erased, and we remember. We tell the truth about what happened and what's still happening. We don't let them make us forget. We don't let them convince us it was a long time ago and doesn't matter anymore. We carry Rosewood with us, not as a burden, but as a reminder of what we can build, what we can survive, and what we refuse to accept. I put my hand on Marcus's shoulder. Your great-great-grandmother Eliza lost everything in Rosewood, everything except her life and her dignity. And you know what she did? She rebuilt. In Jacksonville, with nothing but her 2 hands and her will, she rebuilt. She raised children, worked hard, saved what little she could, and she passed something down to her daughter, who passed it to her son, my father, who passed it to me, and now to you. What did she pass down? The story, the truth, the refusal to disappear. You're here, Marcus. You're getting ready to go to college to make something of your life. That's her legacy. That's Rosewood's legacy. They tried to destroy us, but here we are, still standing, still building, still rising. Marcus's eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. I'm going to tell this story, Grandpa, at college, to my friends, to anyone who'll listen. I'm going to make sure people know. I know you will. And that's exactly what those people in Rosewood would have wanted. Not pity, not anger, just truth, just memory, just justice in whatever form we can achieve it. We got back in the truck and drove the rest of the way home. As we pulled into my driveway, Marcus said, "Can we go back there, to Rosewood?" "Anytime you want. I want to bring a camera next time, take pictures of where everything was, maybe make a video, put it online. People should see it." I smiled. "That's a good idea. You could research more stories, interview people from the Rosewood Heritage Foundation, really dig deep." "Yeah," he said, excitement creeping into his voice despite the heavy subject. "I could make it my college application essay, or maybe a documentary project, something that reaches people." "Your great-great-grandmother would be proud," I said. "Hell, I'm proud." We sat in the truck for a moment, neither of us quite ready to end the day. "Grandpa, thank you for taking me there, for telling me the truth, for not letting me go through life not knowing. Thank you for listening, for caring, for wanting to carry this forward." As Marcus got out of the truck, he turned back to me. Those 6 days in January 1923, that's when Rosewood was destroyed. But when was it really lost? I thought about that. It was lost when the last person who remembered it personally died, when Minnie Lee Langley passed away, when the last survivor who could say, "I was there, I saw it, I lived it," was gone. That's when we went from lived memory to historical memory. But then again, I continued, maybe it was never lost. Maybe it's been here all along, in the ground, in the trees, in the stories we tell, in the anger we feel, in the determination we carry. Maybe Rosewood is right here. I touched my chest over my heart. And here. I pointed at Marcus. He nodded, understanding. "I'll keep it here then, and I'll pass it on, just like you did." That night, lying in bed, I thought about my father bringing me to Rosewood for the first time, just like I'd brought Marcus. I thought about the chain of memories stretching back through generations, each person receiving the story and holding it like a sacred trust. I thought about Eliza Holloway running through the woods with fire at her back, carrying nothing but her life and her memories. I thought about Sarah Carrier making her last stand in that burning house. I thought about all the names we know and all the names we don't, all the lives interrupted, all the dreams destroyed. And I thought about Marcus, driving away with a folder full of photos and documents and a head full of stories that would change how he saw the world. Rosewood was gone. The buildings, the streets, the physical town, all gone, reclaimed by the forest. But the story remained, the truth remained, the memory remained, and as long as people like Marcus were willing to listen, willing to learn, willing to carry that memory forward and refuse to let it die, Rosewood remained too, not as it was, but as it should be remembered, a testament to what Black people could build when given a chance, and a warning of what could be destroyed when hatred was allowed to run unchecked. Tomorrow, Marcus would wake up and start researching. He'd find survivor testimonies, historical documents, academic papers about the massacre. He'd probably call the Rosewood Heritage Foundation, maybe plan a more extensive visit. And someday, he'd bring his own children or grandchildren to that spot in the woods where a town used to be. He'd show them the photos, tell them the stories, make sure they understood. That's how Rosewood survives. Not in wood and brick, but in words and memory and the refusal to forget. That's how we all survive. I closed my eyes, and just before sleep took me, I whispered the names one more time. Sarah Carrier, Sylvester Carrier, James Carrier, Lexi Gordon, Mingo Williams, Sam Carter, and all the others whose names we'll never know. Rest in power. Your story lives on.